Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining me in this illustrious panel for what I hope is a future, a panel style of live stream for authors, booktubers, book readers of all sorts called Proseborn. And I thought, what better way to kind of kick this series off than to extend a hand and help an author who's been at work for a long time on her books. And I'll get to her in just a second and explain where we're at. But real quick, before I introduce our guests, I'm going to say hello to a few of the folks that we have in our chat for watching us. If you are watching us, we are live on YouTube and X and over on the Green Machine. We are also simul streaming to several of the panel people on the panel's channels. We've got more guests who are going to be coming in. A few people are going to be running a little late. Mr. Steven Erikson should be here in about an hour or so. But let me say hello to a few of our folks. Mr. Bob, who is waiting. It is midnight, and he's staying awake for this. I don't know who Bob is. Probably somebody else. Mr. Timothy Wolf, good to see you. Chippepo's Library, thanks for showing up. T. Baggins, thank you for being here. David Cornelson, good to see you, sir. Mr. Andrew Campbell, all the way over from Australia. Glad to see you, sir. My good friend, Mr. Batsauce. I'm not going to read that. Belltube, good to see you, sir. Thank you for dropping in. Mr. Mark Timoney, also from Australia. I don't know how to pronounce this. Torikson? I'm not sure, but whatever. Talking Story is here. Good to see you, sir. Always a pleasure. Zaki and Aki, Bertie Sanders. I'm not normally having this many people, so my chat introductions are running a little long here. Mr. JCM Byrne, good to see you, sir. Which one's the real Phillip Chase? We don't know. And I think that's the mystery is best left unsolved. Thank you for all joining me. I'm John A. Douglas. I'm an independently published epic fantasy author, and everyone here is new to my channel, and I'll explain what happened. Miss Janny Wurts, who is a very well tenured epic fantasy author, is releasing, I think, does it launch today, Miss Janny?
Today.
The Song of the Memories, which is the final book in her, sorry, a little jittery here. I haven't had enough coffee. The final book in your War of Light and Shadows series. And that was something that you said got started 50 years ago. And to me, that's an accomplishment that should be noted. So when she mentioned on social media that she didn't have like anything really planned for this, I kind of said, hey, why don't you just come on my channel and, we'll celebrate. And she brought all her friends with her. A lot of faces that I have seen in the booktube and book reading spaces. Well, I'll introduce real quick. We have another one that just popped in. And I will go around the horn, and I'll start with our new guest, Miss Johanna Reads. Thank you for being here this evening.
Thank you so much for letting me be part of the celebration. Congratulations, Janny. Happy to be here.
And moving up, Mr. AP from the YouTube channel, A Critical Dragon. Dude, thank you for dropping in. It's good to see you.
It's great to be here, John. Thank you for inviting me. Any chance to celebrate the 11th book in an undecalogue, because let's use the grown-up words for this. This is a fantastic achievement, particularly in the challenging publishing climb of epic fantasy at the minute, and the fact that Janny Wurts has been writing brilliant fantasy for so long without the recognition that I think that she deserves. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Not a problem. Right above him is Mr. Blaise of the Under the Radar SFF podcast. And someone whose Twitter account I have seen around, but we haven't interacted too much. But thank you for being here, sir.
Thank you, John, for having me. It's very nice to be here and to celebrate Janny's the finale in her 11-book series. I remember when I first read this book, The Curse of Mysteries, during the pandemic. I knew it was a gem. And now that it's finally getting out into the world, I'm so excited to share it with everybody and to talk about all the good stuff to come.
And thank you for joining me, Mr. P.L. Stuart, who is the author of, is it The Drowned Kingdom or A Drowned Kingdom?
It's the Drowned Kingdom saga.
Sorry, I get those little words messed up sometimes.
That's all good. Thank you so much, John, for having me. Great to be here with these esteemed guests who I consider friends, and of course to celebrate Janny and the momentous occasion of the publication of the ultimate book in our iconic series. I am just so happy to be here and so happy for Janny. And again, just echoing the sentiments that she is an iconic author who is deserving of all recognition. So congratulations, Janny.
Thank you.
And a gentleman that I both admire and have long watched on the YouTube spaces. Looking at everybody that's here, I got to tell you, I feel outclassed on my own channel, but probably no one more so than Mr. Phillip Chase, who I think you get to teach fantasy, basically, right?
Well, which one of us should answer that question?
The one that's talking right now.
It's John. Thank you so much for hosting this. This is very gracious of you. And I want to congratulate Janny Wurts on this achievement. Song of the Mysteries, Book 11. This is 50 years in the making, people. And I feel so fortunate to be present for this. I am myself be starting the 6th book in the series, and AP, or my nemesis, and Johanna are discussing the series with me. I feel so fortunate to be reading this beautiful series that I am convinced is going to go down as one of the greatest achievements in the fantasy genre and in literature. I'm just in awe of your writing, Janny Wurts. So congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you for being here.
And lastly, but definitely not least, the lady of the hour, Miss Janny Wurts, a fantasy author for Janny. We were talking a little bit before the stream, but for the sake of the audience, tell us, how long have you been doing this whole epic fantasy writing thing?
Well, I'll get to that in a moment. I want to say Niko will be late, and so will Steven Erikson. If he didn't get my email correcting the time, because he said he was going to be on at 5 his time, and should be actually 4. So those two will come. How did I get started? The seed idea was in 1972, and I felt I did not have the life experience or the literary ability to write this. The idea was just too big for where I was at the time. So I published 4 novels, traveled the world, and acquired the life experience to write the series. And I did not sell the first book until it was completely written in 1993, excuse me. And I had draft at that point up to about book 7, and I had extensive notes for the rest of it. So I knew exactly what I was doing at that moment in time. So the idea was so big, I felt it required the time to develop and not just jump and throw it out there, that I would regret it if I did. So that is why it's been 50 years in the making. And we all know that the climate to do a huge series over that span of time, publishing changes came faster and faster and faster. The world is very different now than it was when this idea was conceived, and that can become a challenge. So I wanted to gather my friends here and get somewhat of a feeling of the International Conference on the Fantastic and the Arts, because we've all met each other face to face and we've all talked, and to talk about what it takes to write an epic fantasy from all angles: experience, writing experience, literary place in the literary field, place in publishing, because we have an incredible group of people here tonight, with more joining us. And unfortunately, Angie from India, she got called into the office, so she had to cancel at the last minute. I'm sorry she won't be with us to have her perspective here too. So please make this a roundtable discussion, because I want to make the experience that's in this panel tonight available to everyone, so we have more epic fantasy in the world.
And that's never a bad thing in my eyes, because and that's one thing, even though I read mostly indie fantasy these days, there's still some good work that's being put out by traditional publishers. And although the trend these days, we were discussing before the stream, is kind of trending towards romantasy. Janny, you and I were just talking about how there's been a lot of female authors that they haven't not a lot of them have quite made their mark quite as strongly as the male authors. But like I've said, some of my favorite authors have been the female authors in the genre, just because it's such a different and unique perspective. I mean, I was talking about that video that I dropped, that 120 minutes of a tribute to Sarah Douglas, who, for my money, is one of the best fantasy authors out there. And so few people remember her work unless you were kind of, of a certain vintage, reading a little more old school stuff. More, new age readers haven't heard of her. And, bless her heart, rest in peace. She passed away in 2011. So some places don't even have her books now. But, I've read a number of female authors who are phenomenal and fantastic. And their work should be recognized.
The list is very long.
Yes.
So what does it take to write an epic fantasy? Because we have authors and we have scholars on this panel tonight.
It takes a lot of coffee. Works for me.
I think grit is one thing that you can safely say it takes to write any book, really. To have written a book is a major accomplishment. To have worked on it, and it's really a labor of love for years and years to make it as great as you can. I don't think too many of us can wrap our minds around spending 50 years on a series of this scale, of this depth. So it's just, it's such a tremendous thing that you've done, Janny. Really, just my hat's off to you for this. But yeah, I think grit, you must have a tremendous amount of grit to have arrived at this place today.
Well, and you just completed your trilogy, so you know what it takes. And here's Paul, who's in the middle of a series, and he can certainly give us a perspective of how frustrating it can be in the middle of a series where there's still major doors to open, major bombs to land on the readers, but it isn't there yet. The proof isn't in the pudding quite yet. And so you have to live through the frustration of what's coming, but the reviewers, the readers, the people opinionating, or the people who are just coming into it have no clue. So how does that feel?
Well, I can say this much, that I echo Philip's sentiment. Two things I'd like to point out. Planning. And Janny, you are masterful at planning, clearly, with the scope of the series that you've produced. And I've been lucky, having been on deep dives with people hosted by Angie, and you've given us tidbits, just little insights through almost the back door, into seeing the immense planning that happens behind the scenes, the hundreds and perhaps thousands of pages of notes and glossaries and family trees, and it takes a lot of planning to deliver on a series of your magnitude. And I think Philip and myself are aware that as authors, and John, of course, that it definitely takes planning. But I'll say perhaps the biggest thing is that it's been said before, but writing is not done quite in the isolated bubble that hey Niko, that some may think it is, and I wouldn't be where I am without the support and love of people such as yourself, Janny. And you've been an amazing, incredible mentor to me, and I've looked up to you, and I'll call you friend. And the same with all the people in this video that have been so supportive of my work and encouraged me. And that I think it literally takes a village to create.
It does. And one of the champions at that is Blaise. Under the Radar Books specializes in bringing titles to notice that have been buried. So point out Sarah Douglas, who I've read her work, to Blaise. He will read it and he will bring notice to it. Blaise has done incredible work because he discovered Light and Shadows about when AP was announcing he was going to make a group read. And those two things made such a big ripple and such a difference to this finish today. So many people would not have found the series without you, Johanna, Blaise. So what's it like, Blaise, finding these gems, and what does it take to bring them to notice?
Well, finding the gems is it's probably the hardest part, but it's also the most fun part to discover something that not a lot of people know about. And in this case, I thought it was criminal that not a lot of people knew about this work. To read it, be in awe of what you're reading. And then, but with each consecutive book, or subsequent book, I should say, Ships is probably one of my favorite books in the series, getting better and better and better, just building on what the previous book has brought to the forefront. I've never read another series like this, apart from Blaise when Erikson comes on. But this, I love finding just hidden gems and just being able to share them, because not every new great series is going to be something that comes out now. There's stuff way back when that is just waiting to be found. I'm so glad I was able to find it, share it, and here we are, 4 years later from when I started this. It's just incredible where you come from, Janny. You know, no one else writes prose or stories like you do. That goes without saying.
One of the things that's been fabulous is single-handedly you guys and AP and Phillip and Johanna, you have changed the narrative around this series on the internet. You have done it where a prose style that was not necessarily what the going thing is. Definitely, I have an original voice. You brought an appreciation of that, and it's just been contagious. And now the right readers who are seeking this kind of book are finding it. And that change in the narrative has made an enormous difference again today. So if you three have anything to say about that, and Niko, your enthusiasm has just been wild. What you've done for this series, I have no words.
I think AP is very well equipped to talk about the prose. I would love to hear what he has to say.
Well, if we have contributed in any way, like I'm very glad that we have, but we can't do anything if you don't have, and I hate to use terminology like this, the product to show people. And one of the things that I absolutely delight in, there are so many different ways to tell a story, but there are always going to be those techniques and styles that appeal to me personally, as well as appeal to my sense of the craft being well done. And what I find with these books, a strong, powerful voice that was clear, was unique, was powerful and poignant and emotive, that with the language on the page, it wasn't trying to emulate any particular, oh, this is the fad, write this way, do this thing. It was trying to use the language of the narrative itself, that the prose, the style was supporting the narrative, was evocative of the setting, and that everything in it was so tightly controlled, but without a sense of it being mechanical, that I had full confidence that this writing knew what it was doing. This author knew what they were doing, that this story was going to go in a direction because the author was in full command, not only of each word in the sentence, each sentence in the paragraph, each paragraph in the scene, and each scene in the chapter, but how it all supported each other. And that level of interrelated complexity and support is not as common as people might think. And it was so wonderful that there are passages that are almost pure poetry in how evocative and poignant they are, and yet they don't stick out as overly embellished purple prose or whatever someone's going to describe it as, because it flowed so naturally. The rhythm of the language was in tune with the action being depicted, the descriptions being narrated. Everything worked together. And this is just representative of a writer who knows her craft inside out, who knows her material inside out, who knows her characters inside out, and who knows this narrative arc and trajectory inside out. This is not for fear of, oh, I've gotten to this point and I'm now going to sprawl off in this direction, which some big name fantasy authors and series have done. But what we had here was no, there's never a sense that these books are going to spiral off and go on a weird digression. Everything was controlled, but that control was so lightly handled that it felt deft, and it wasn't mechanical, and it wasn't forcing the narrative. Everything appeared organic, but you could see the level of meticulous craft in it. So that's all I would say about this, that no one can, we couldn't have been as enthusiastic about this if it had been mediocre. The joy is it's extraordinary. And when you have something extraordinary, then you can talk about it passionately. And the fact that the writing on these pages can sustain the level of scrutiny that quite often we bear down with, that we look at surface level, context, subtext, intertextual referencing, that the fact that it can bear that level of scrutiny and still be rewarding and enjoyable is an amazing achievement.
Welcome, Steven. We were talking about what it takes to write epic fantasy and how you set the narrative for getting your epic to the correct audience, from the prose style to the concepts, to the depth, to the expanse, to the breadth. So we're happy.
Much to say on that, I'm sure. Well, apologies for coming late. I'm still a bit jet lagged, and arithmetic is not my forte, so I got the times wrong. But I was not surprised that when I finally came on this feed, AP was talking.
I egged him on.
I have to say, Mr. Steven Erikson, first of all, thank you for joining us this evening. But if you got $1 every time a booktuber even said the word Malazan, you'd be a multi-millionaire.
Well, sure, if you count all the negatives, yeah.
There's no such thing as bad press, though, right?
I suppose not.
Well, we can always talk about your magnum opus, Willful Child, instead.
So, Steven, we'll go ahead and pick your brain while you're here for the time that we have you. What do you feel it takes to write epic fantasy? And from everything that I've heard, I apologize, I haven't picked up Malazan yet, although I have been pressured, a lot of peer pressure on the DM side of things by a lot of my book reading friends, some of whom are present here, to pick it up and get started. What are your thoughts on what it takes to write epic fantasy?
Wow. Well, I don't know. I mean, in the sense of, I wasn't thinking in terms of writing epic fantasy. I wasn't sort of coming up with a definition for that particular subgenre. I just wanted to write a story that evoked as much of the human condition as possible, on as grand a scale as possible, but at the same time sort of holding on to my sort of literary origins in this genre, which was sword and sorcery, which is very individual based. It's a small scale approach to the fantasy world. So I wanted to kind of combine those two notions. The big epic stuff like Donaldson stuff and that kind of thing with the sword and sorcery of Fritz Leiber and that kind of stuff. So I really wasn't interested in sort of fitting into that one particular definitive box of what constitutes epic fantasy. And to this day, I really don't think of the writing I'm doing in that context. I think that's kind of there for the reviewers and the critics more than anything else.
One of the things your work totally succeeds at is the layers and the epochs. You managed to put so much history on the page. It just rocks my mind every time I pick up one of your books. Even if I just want to look at a paragraph that you did or look up a piece of the action or something that you handled, that sense of age, history, shifting tides of time, shifting perspectives. You're better than anyone else at putting that one all encapsulated in every sentence that you write. It's amazing.
Well, thank you. I guess the archaeology really fed into that. you know, I basically spent all my summers wandering landscapes and trying to sort of imagine what they were like 800 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago. And then usually as an archaeologist, when you're surveying and you're trying to sort of find sites, you have to peel everything back in time. So you have to engage your imagination at that point. So, you know, archaeology is not just the academic side, the technical side of stuff. There is a lot of imagination actually involved in the process. So I guess I was just engaged in that exercise all along without entirely being aware of where I would apply it later in writing. So that may be one of the reasons for that kind of sense of deep time, because everywhere I go, I see it, right? Especially I've just come back from Europe, and that sense of deep time is just present everywhere. And it's for me, it's impossible to escape seeing it.
Well, you certainly bring an organic sense of it being under the skin when you write, and it's one of the delights. It's truly one of the delights. Johanna, what do you have to say?
Well, again, it's just an honor to be here. I don't know that there's much more I can add to what AP said earlier about your prose. It's just been such a delight to talk about your books. I've had so much fun talking with both AP and Phillip. And the words that always come to mind whenever I think about your series, Janny, is the word prismatic and kaleidoscopic, because there are so many different ways of looking at your stories, so many different angles. And I think we have a lot of fun, the three of us, looking at the book in different ways. AP comes from obviously a richer background in literature, as does Phillip, than I do. One thing that comes up for me a lot is I used to study opera, and that was actually my passion for many years. I used to get together with a group of friends every weekend, and we'd watch an opera DVD together and analyze the singers, or I'd be in voice lessons, and sometimes I wouldn't sing, and my teacher and I would just talk about what the lyrics were doing and what the accompaniment was doing and all the different layers with that. And I feel like it's kind of similar to analyzing literature and subtext in a way. And that's how I feel when I'm reading Wars of Light and Shadow. I feel like there is no other series in my mind that would be better adapted for opera. And opera is an art that not everybody gets, and they don't get it right away either. I remember the first time I listened to opera, I wasn't sure I really liked it that much. And my husband has told me, you don't want to know what those voices sound like to my ears. But once I started to really take my time with opera and really understand it, and take, you know, that's what your books require. They require a certain mindfulness, a certain slowing down, as you've mentioned. Once you really take it in, there's something that's so beautiful that opens up before you. And I think that that's the power of your writing. It's so picturesque, it's so colorful and vivid. You bring forth color and light and shadow in your words, and they evoke so much imagery and so much drama that for me, it's that rich experience. When I'm listening to opera, there's a rich sense of beauty that I just don't get. I love other styles of music. I even enjoy pop now and then. I listen to other styles, but when I'm listening to opera, there's this depth that I don't get from any other genre. And so I feel like your books, like when I say that they could be adapted for opera, I mean that as the highest compliment possible. So that's what I'll add.
It's really cool that you're bringing a musical background to it, because I love music, and there is a musical beat to the prose itself. I hear it as well as what it's saying and evoking on the page. So that's really fabulous. You brought your perspective to it. And Niko, with all your wild enthusiasm, it's so good to have you here.
I'm so glad to be here. I was a little messed up on time as well, but I wanted to make sure that I came too. It does work out because the mouths and books happen to be right next to me, and then yours up here, so it kind of double worked out here. But yeah, I'm a little bit newer to the series overall, with just really reading just about all of it last year. I randomly came across an old copy of a bind up of Cycle of Fire at a used bookstore, and I saw it and I'm like, okay, that looks awesome. I'm picking this up. And that was how I first found your stuff. And I read it and I'm like, I got to chapter 9 and it blew my mind a little bit because I wasn't expecting that at all. If you know, you know. Um, and and then I'm like, oh, this is really good. I start talking about it. I hadn't heard a lot of people, and then people were like, oh, you think that's good? Just wait until you try Words of Light and Shadow. And I see, oh, it's this really big, long, epic fantasy series, and so I know I'm gonna have to start it. And the first book, which I just started my first reread with the wonderful audio, which is out now, by the way. And I'm just going back, and it presents like it's such this, you know, classic fantasy thing you've kind of seen, and then as you get in, it just gets so much deeper and more complex and subverts every trope you can think of. And it's just, for me, the thing that excites me the most is I love a world that I can really dig into, and I'm so world building focused. So this was just a series that I really just felt completely ensconced in, and just was able to just dive in so deep. And I'll just ditto everything AP said about the prose, because he definitely said a lot better than I could say it. But just everything about it, it's like such a happy place going in and reading. And Ships and Mary or the bind up is where I just really fell in love, and I never looked back. I ended up binging a lot of it, and the last book, for those who have not read it yet, is just so good. Everything you want and more, and things you didn't even know you wanted. It's just so good, so worth it, and I can't wait for you all to be able to read it. But I as of last month, I finished reading every single book that you've written, Janny, besides Empire, which doesn't count because it's not solo. I'm gonna still read it, but I've read all of your solo work now at this point too, and just I've enjoyed all of it. And that is something too. I think with Malazan being such an expansive world is also tied together too. It's something that just excites me when there's a lot of world building there. And you two also world build very differently in a lot of ways, I think, and it had a really different approach. And so that's always something that I'm just fascinated with. And from talking to Janny, and Steven Erikson, I haven't had the pleasure of talking to you before this too, but I've definitely seen lots of videos with you too. So that's always something that just fascinates me with the approach to world building too. So if any of you guys have any additional thoughts on that, I would love to hear them.
We have some writers here writing epic fantasy that take it to another level in some ways. Steven and Phillip, and certainly Wars of Light and Shadow, not only the epic moment where there's that wrenching change where societies collide and things come out the other end different, but the whole concept of compassion, the whole lifting it to a spiritual level, the whole angle of view, looking at more than just the physical events on the page, and the splitting of consciousness and the putting it back together again, and the so I was really pleased that Phillip is here and that Steven is here, because there's no more fitting writers to be here for War of Light and Shadows, and Paul too, because I don't know where your series is going yet. You're at that half point where it could go anywhere. So if anyone has anything to say about that, because a lot of the great epic fantasy that's out there, I mean, certainly Donaldson delves very, very deep. Certainly Tolkien did a monumental work, but I feel like you guys are coming at it from an angle that's one step further than many authors dare to tread.
I think it was Chibipo, who is in the chat right now, who came up with the phrase transcendental fantasy as applied to Wars of Light and Shadow. And I think it's an apt way to describe Malazan as well. And it's certainly something that I have tried to do in my trilogy, in the Adan trilogy. Something that I've already seen 5-6 books into Wars of Light and Shadow, I certainly see all over Malazan, is the idea that of knowing others. And often we think we know the narrative. We have our label ready for that person that we encounter. And what both of your series, Janny and Steven, have done for me, I think beautifully, and for lots of other readers as well, is to show us how a person can be so much more than that label that we have for them, that when we see ourselves in that person, we recognize their humanity and we see our connection to them, there is a sense of transcending the self in that act of, let's call it, compassion. And there's a certain beauty to that I feel is a theme that must be endlessly explored by authors. It is my only hope for us as a species, frankly, is for us to explore that and to learn how we can do that in our own lives. I mean, just literature is so important. That's why works like The Wars of Light and Shadow and the Malazan book, The Fallen, are so important to me, because I believe this is not, I mean, yes, they're very entertaining and they're fun to get immersed in and all of that, but I believe that what they teach us is vital to how we conduct ourselves as humans. And perhaps even in terms of whether or not we'll make it into future millennia. So I really strongly believe that this is what you two have done for us, for your readers, is just so vitally important. And I really I'm so grateful to be a reader of your series.
So here's John, just starting out with his first book, his debut. Do you want to tell us a bit about that, John?
I can tell a little bit about it, although this is the first thing that I put out there for the world to read. I've been writing since like 1993. I was a hobby writer for a very long time. And it was just something to pass the time, and until I got to this point where I was writing stories, and I was looking at it and going, I know it's weird for some people to read their own work, but I'm going, this is entertaining even myself. I'm going back and rereading my own work and thinking I could probably make a go of this. And so then I started the process of writing a lot of the novels that I mentioned earlier that were so bad that God killed the computer that they were on in a flood in 2016. Good riddance to those, though. Thank God no one will ever see them again. That's all right. You guys have elevated a lot of the literature that you write to almost a different level. Me, I've always kind of approached it from the level of just that 16-year-old kid walking into Walden Books and just staring at these massive shelves of books with epic artwork on the front and just trying to decide which one do I pick out and take home with me. Which one do I spend my allowance on and take home and start reading? And, arguably there were some series if I could go back, I'd probably slap the book out of my hand and say, no, try this one instead. So me, I've always been kind of a humble and very not to say you guys are pretentious. I'm unpretentious. I look at the epic fantasy from the perspective of someone who has looked at a lot of entertainment that I've enjoyed over many decades and watched very bad creative decisions, very bad storytelling ruin things that I used to enjoy a lot. And so, like a lot of authors, the approach that I took was, okay, the things that I enjoy are not good anymore. I'm just going to write what I want to read. And I approached it from the perspective of learning the craft, learning what works in a story, learning what doesn't work in a story, the tropes, the conventions, the twists that I don't care for, and trying to figure out how to avoid those pitfalls. And so when I wrote my first book, The Black Crown, where finally the storytelling aspect of novel writing just clicked, I remembered the words of my father, which were, you never get a second chance to make a first impression. And so I aimed for something that I felt would be a bit of a crowd pleaser. And I'm still getting, reviews to this day. It launched in November, and I'm still getting, reviews now, which is, it's thrilling to see people enjoy what I've written. And perhaps even my favorite review was from a fellow indie author, Luis Magalhaus, who said, I'm paraphrasing here, but finishing the book just made him feel happy. Because to me as a reader, that's what I love when I get done reading, especially a fantasy book, because they're taking me places I could not go in real life. They're showing me, telling me stories that you could not tell in real life. And they're, communicating very humanistic ideals and themes through a very epic lens. To me, epic fantasy has to be epic. It can be epic in every aspect. From the romance to the world building to the events to the action, even if you have or have no action. But it's telling you something that's epic in scope. And that's the feeling that I always like to chase when I write, that you, at the very least, can lose yourself in a book for a few hours. And when you close that book, you've got a sense of accomplishment. You've got a sense that you were entertained. You were not let down. You gave your trust to the author. And when you give your trust to the author and let them tell the story the way they want to, a lot of times, they'll take you in a direction that you might not have known you were going, sometimes twists and turns. And then sometimes just using the conventions of the genre to give you something that makes you feel like you may have seen it before, but you enjoy it as if it was the first time you've ever read it.
You blew my mind, Stephen, when you said you started out mixing Fafford and the Mouser with something like Donaldson. It's like I never knew that was sort of your beginning. So a small seed can make a very big story.
I think so. And I mean, one of the things I just wanted to mention is it's so gratifying to see that you're getting great attention, Janny. You and I sat and talked at ICFA a few times, and most of what we were discussing was kind of the author's position in the creating of these things, and how that in itself was transformative. And if anyone else sort of comes on board and reads our stuff, and is in some way changed in terms of their outlet, their outlook. That is the reward that we're seeking. So I don't know if I was going anywhere with that, but it's so cool to see that there's so much discussion on BookTube regarding your work. It's long overdue.
Well, the people here today were instrumental in making that happen, and that's part of why they're here. Absolutely awesome. So I'm really privileged to have such a lineup. Don't be quiet, you guys. Bust in and say what you want to say.
I will give a big thanks to one of Hale the Lore, who is one of my mods. Dropped all of your links in the chat. Thank you, Hale, for that selfless bit of work. The mods are always appreciated, but he works overtime to get those out there. I have a few questions that I held over. If anyone wants to, feels like answering a few.
Fire away.
Mr. Andrew Campbell, who is a aspiring indie author over in Australia, asked this every stream I'm in with another author. Where do you get your ideals? And perhaps a bit of a follow-up here. How does one go about creating diverse races and cultures that are unique? So maybe we could curtail both of those in the same one. What about you, Janny?
Well, I like Harlan Ellison's response to that idea. He buys a six-pack of ideas from Poughkeepsie. Because honestly, ideas are plentiful. Ideas that are worth making a story out of are rare.
I agree. Mr. Steven, what about you, sir?
Ideas?
I have pulled the chain there.
I don't know where ideas come from. I mean, we all have, at least as far as I understand it, we have internal narratives everywhere we go. We all have that voice in our head that never shuts up. And I tend to make, everybody's agreeing? Yeah, okay. I tend to make use of that. I tend to exploit it. If it's not going to shut up, then tell me a good story. And so that's where, as I'm walking around, I start assembling what could be an interesting story. And so I let that internal narrative basically create something. And then at some point, I'll step back and think, well, is that actually worth pursuing in terms of putting words on the page? And more often than not, it's not. But it fills the time in the meantime. But occasionally, yeah, it's an idea worth pursuing, and then I just let it haunt me for as long as possible until I'm ready to write.
All right. Phillip, what about you, sir?
Oh my goodness. Well, first, I think ideas come from this soup of stories that I've consumed for my entire life, and going all over the place. Everybody here knows I like Beowulf. I had to say Beowulf at least once. But thank you.
Let me scratch that off my bingo card.
Oh, I got the F-bomb. Wow. Oh, no.
Beowulf. We knew it was coming.
But yeah, no, in all seriousness, I think the ideas can emerge either consciously or unconsciously as a result of all the stories that we've encountered and that we've interacted with. And yes, I'm a planner when I write, and I have all kinds of things out on the paper, but sometimes it feels like the story just tells you what to do. Sometimes a character in the story just grabs you by the shirt and says, you didn't know, you thought you were going to do that, but no, you have to go here now. And you have to follow that. And I don't know if anyone can explain exactly what's going on when that happens, but there's something about the creative process that brings that about. And I'm sure that anyone here who's done anything creative you're in this space, this free flowing, wonderful space where it's just coming out of you, and you have to follow that. Some of the I think some of the best stuff that I've written has been a result of that creative process that happens when you're in that flow. Absolutely, I think. I don't. PL, have you? I'm sure you've experienced stuff like that when you've been writing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think ideas come from all around us. I think that ideas come from. It's almost it's a symbiotic relationship whereby I could look at Janny's painting, and it may not be about her series. And Dawn, obviously, both of them brilliant artists, and that may inspire an idea. I can read your book, Phillip, or read Steven's book, and it may give me an idea. I may decide to take an element in a different direction, but yet the seeds came from something that I read in one of your books. Life experience, though, I think ultimately is for me the biggest where I seem to generate the most ideas, and from history. I'm a big history nerd, and looking at the past, looking at our past fascinates me, and I love the circle of history. I love history, seeing history repeat itself, not necessarily in all its forms, because some of those forms aren't so great. But I love looking at history as an inspiration, and I love circular plots, writing circular plots in my books. What has come before will happen again, and so there's inspiration and ideas all around us.
All right. I will ask this next question from Mr. E.L. Montague. I think this is a really good question. Have you ever found that your readers get a very different message from your work than you got while creating? But hold on, before I go to this, Janny, for this question, I should probably answer the question myself from the last one. Where do I get my... Andrew's heard this before, but I like I explained to Janny a little before, I probably grew up in the day and age when autism was not a thing. So I probably had high functioning autism, and I had a lot of troubles paying attention in school. And I had an overactive imagination that did not stop, and to this day does not stop. So being a hobby writer and having all these unfiltered ideas, the question then became, how do I take what I'm daydreaming up, a scene, a character, a concept, and attaching an interesting story and a compelling narrative to it? But moving on to EL's question. Janny, have you ever found that your readers get a very different message from your work than you got while creating it?
Happens all the time, but that's part of what the magic and alchemy of a story is. You put it out there, and people bring their individual differences of opinion, of experience to those words, and it has a different meaning. And so suddenly it isn't just one story, it's two. Bring in another reader and it's three. So it's an infinite number of reflections of what that original manuscript can create. And so that I find is totally fascinating. I think we're individuals for absolutely a reason. And the reverberation of where a word can go is limitless. And I think going back to the other, your experience growing up, John, it made me remember something I haven't thought about for years. And that was I had an unstoppable imagination also during high school and school years where everything was constrained, behavior was constrained, what you could do, what you could wear, what you could think, the whole peer pressure thing. And one thing that I did to trick myself or to make it okay to have that imagination was I could say I'm writing a story about it, and that made it legitimate.
Where did you? Who would be telling you that? Like the figures above you, like your teachers or your parents?
Parents, teachers, religion, everything around you. You're always being told, be this marble and go down this chute and don't dare flip over the rail. Because we are social creatures, and the person who was separate from the pack was prey. It's dangerous to leave the consensus. And so all these people telling you what you can be, what you can do, what you think, they mean well. But there's constant pressure, especially for a young girl growing up, what you can and you can't do, what you can and you can't say. And at that time, what you could and couldn't be in society. I can remember being 6 years old and saying, I want to go be a fireman. And my brother going, you can't, you're a girl. Well, I want to go do this. Well, you can't, you're a girl. That message being drummed into you from the minute you could stand up and walk. And so I think it takes.
So she's everything.
Yeah, you've got to rebel. And I'm sure that's true for young men too. You've got to rebel because that pressure to be consensus is so strong. Share your experience. I mean, that was my experience. People here might have different ones, just like a word can have a different reverberation and a different meaning to every person that comes to that word. Growing up with the constraints and the pressures of being told what you can and can't do is going to have a different effect on every one of you. How did you rebel?
I kind of didn't. I never rebelled against my parents, like a lot of teenagers did, but I rebelled a lot against my own generation because I grew up as a teenager in the 90s at a point where rebellion got sold as a bit of a marketing tactic. I'm finding this out these days. There's a lot of icons of rebellion and punk culture and whatnot back in the old days that have now kind of turned into a different cloak, and some of them have become exactly what they used to fight against. And so where a lot of the teenagers of my era, Miss Janny, were, what's the usual thing you think of when you think of teenagers being rebellious? They go out and they go smoking, they go drinking, they go partying. And I never did any of that.
Doesn't have to be that.
Well, and I think
it's the most readily example I can think of off the top of my head.
Reading fantasy is kind of our rebellion against society. First of all, no one reads anymore, right? Second of all, you read this nerdy thing that only the dorks do, and and it's kind of our rebellion of like, yeah, I'm going to, and guess what we've done by continuing to do it? It's kind of actually popular now after all these years, and it's, I don't know about cool, but semi-cool in many areas. And I think it's a great area that we've all kind of rebelled in is people see my fantasy book with my dragons on it. You know what? I love it. I don't care.
Well, is epic fantasy itself a rebellion? Do we take these huge whopping worlds and societies and break them just so that we can reassemble it from a different perspective? How much of that is a rebellion?
I mean, you talk about there are people that do not know the inner workings of their own government, but can tell you the intricate inter-house relationships of every character and house in Game of Thrones. maybe it's just a little more interesting.
Fantasy as rebellion is a tradition that goes way back. You can look at William Morris in writing his prose romances of the 1890s, and those are those are visions of a different society from what he was living in. That was an act of rebellion against the ugliness that he saw all around him. And that is a tradition that Tolkien picks up very directly from William Morris in many ways. Tolkien's environmentalism is very much related to William Morris's. And Ursula Le Guin, was a rebel of a kind through her beautiful Earthsea books. Certainly as she progressed in the later books of Earthsea, she was putting forth a vision. I think that's what we do. Fantasy as a genre is really good at putting forth alternative visions. And that is one of the beautiful things about our genre. It absolutely encourages the freedom of the imagination in that sense. So that's a wonderful thing. So I think Bryce absolutely said it well. If you're reading fantasy, man, you're a rebel.
And I think I'm surrounded here by, I haven't had the privilege of reading John's work yet, but I think I'm surrounded by 3 very intentional writers. But yet, not every piece of literature, not every piece of writing, including fantasy, is trying to project a message necessarily. Some of it is simply great entertainment, and that's what the author's objective is, and they're trying to entertain primarily and not necessarily project or broadcast the message. But I think, again, based on the company I'm in and what I've read from certainly Janny, Steven, and Phillip, that definitely there's some messages in their work and some wonderful, poignant messages, and some messages that give me pause and make me think and make me re-examine the world. And I think, again, fantasy is a wonderful venue to do that in, because, in some ways people feel, okay, I'm detached from the real world and I can take this message that's being delivered and yet in some ways distance myself. And so that's, I think fantasy serves a great purpose there.
Well, I think for me, one of the draws of epic fantasy for me, particularly with Wurts' writing, Erikson's writing, to point out too, is the use of the micro scale and the macro scale. So, like, typically when we talk about epic, we talk about these world-shaping events, the big armies, the grand scale, like from that epic tradition, that tradition of storytelling that has been popular for, at least 2,000 years. It has some legs. But one of the things that makes Malazan and the Wars of Light and Shadow stand out to me so much is that grand scale is evoked through the actions on the micro scale, the characters themselves, that there is an evocation of the deeply personal and the placement of someone trapped in a difficult situation, doing their best and struggling and trying to get through. And then the ramifications play out of that. And one of the reasons this speaks to me so strongly is sometimes we feel that we are powerless in this world, and that these epic fantasies, they can show what one person can do, what a small group of people can do, what a band of people can do when they come together. And we invest in those stories because every part that they play, each one is a small part, but it builds and it builds. And that moves up into this epic scale. And suddenly these small actions, the loyalty, the camaraderie, the emotion and the sacrifices these characters make, they take on meaning and resonance. And that, to me, particularly given where I grew up, that has always been a draw of this, that you can make a difference in this world. And we get surrounded by so much messaging about how you can't, you're powerless. But epic fantasy, for me, is an exploration of, no, this is confirmation. You can. These stories only happen because of the characters that are going through these things. And very few of them are the characters who go, I am the world's most powerful figure and I'm going to stride forth and solve all of these issues with my sword. Because those are not the stories that we remember. Those stories fall away. The ones we remember are where we find these human characters, these flawed characters, these people who are making the best of what is in front of them. And we follow them on their trials and tribulations. And that just speaks to me. So it's one of the reasons why epic fantasy as a subgenre just is one of my favorites. It's why I love it so much.
Yeah, just to expand on what you were saying, AP, too, I think part of what comes to my mind, too, is expanding your worldview. So going from the micro to the macro, not just rebelling against what is, but realizing there's more to what is. And that's something that I feel I see in a lot of epic fantasy, including the ones I've read of the people who are present, is just having that journey and learning from the person that you assumed was wrong, or the person that you had a certain perspective of for whatever reason. So I think that could be just as powerful a journey, and a powerful journey for us as readers too, to realize our world is bigger than we make it out to be, or people are bigger than we make them out to be. We ourselves are also, we can be agents of change, of course, but there's more to learn.
Yeah, that's beautifully said, both of you, AP and Johanna. And just want to point people to Stephen Donaldson's essays on epic fantasy, which really express a lot of what has been said here so beautifully. And that's why he calls epic fantasy the literature of reintegration, because we live in a world where often we do feel like our lives can be meaningless, that there is no intrinsic meaning to the universe. But participating in that journey with the characters on a quest, it can be empowering in a way that lets us feel that there is meaning to our struggle, that we can craft it. So really appreciate that.
Okay, Star Wars mention, that's another one on the bingo card.
All right, I'm all for any Star Wars mention. That's great.
Yeah, and then Star Wars at its heart is a fantasy story, I think.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of the traditional elements. And one of the things I like about fantasy is that as time goes on, what you notice with the trends it goes through, the phases and ages that it goes through, you will have a lot of people that not so much chasing trends, but writing a lot of very similar work. And inevitably, you come to a point where somebody comes along, takes the conventions, and just tells the right story the right way, and it breaks through and reinvigorates the entire genre. Game of Thrones is an example. It's the most readily example I can think of. But then you had Dragonlance in the 80s, and that kind of broke it out of the kind of pulp era that it was in, and kind of brought about the mass published paperbacks of that era. And then going into the 90s, you had more darker fantasy like Sarah Douglas and Terry Goodkind that started to pop up. And we're kind of in our romantasy arc at the moment, but at some point something will break through that, and that will kind of become the new trend. But the genre, for all its conventions and tropes, always manages to find a way to have the most unique voice, break through, and have something new to say, something interesting. And I think that is one of the reasons it's so long lived, is that it keeps telling interesting stories, and it keeps doing something unique and interesting and new.
John, you're scaring me. What are we going to have with the reader who starts with romantasy and then strikes to write Erikson? Just as Fafford and the Mouser Donaldson stepped into. You're scaring me. How are we going to blend this new thing that's coming barreling in? What's that going to make? It's going to wobble everything for a while.
That's a good question for the panel. Where do you guys kind of see fantasy going from here on out? Because we got a lot of readers in. We got a lot of booktubers in the panel, and you guys are kind of at as best you can. I know everyone's TBR is a flaming dumpster fire. Okay, mine included. But a lot of us kind of have our finger on the pulse of where fantasy is right now. Where do you guys think that it's kind of going into the future?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I don't think there's really a right answer either. But some things that I kind of think about is we're at a spot right now, which it's a bit cyclical, and it's the genre I think has done it before too, where a lot of what's new and what's coming out there is kind of simplifying and streamlining, and trying to just appeal to the masses, and the easy product. And there's nothing wrong with it. That's kind of like it was mentioned. It's some people are writing more so just for entertainment, and there's not a lot deeper there. But that also, I feel like, on the other side of the coin, encourages people who are either writing or looking to read the deeper stuff, the bigger stuff. And so I think it's, while romantasy is definitely big right now, and we're at the time where instead of the Tolkien clones, we have the Sanderson clones, and there's some plenty of good stuff there too. But it's it gets people where they're like, okay, this is kind of fun, but like, where does it go from here? And so I think it opens up a lot for those deeper kind of things. And I'm always the person that I've read a lot of the popular modern fantasy, but I'm always like, I want to find the next big deeper thing, and that's my quest to read all the really big fantasy series. That's why I read. I'm trying so hard to say Malazan because I don't pronounce it that way, and I can't force my brain to, but I know it's correct. I figure if I'm on a live stream with the author, I should probably pronounce it the way I know it's correct. But that's why I read that. And Thomas Covenant, we mentioned Donaldson, and Hobb and Jordan, and some lesser known ones too, like Crown of Stars and other stuff like that. And side note, 90s is top tier fantasy just in general. Any series that has a lot of entries in the 90s is probably something I'm going to enjoy, I've found. But it's I think it's an exciting time because we have a lot of the kind of the streamlined stuff, but that also is, even though a lot of it's not my favorite, it gets more people looking, and then there's so much more for them to find, including stuff by a lot of people here.
My feeling is that often the best stuff that happens in the genre happens because it's niche. And in a way, the doors blew wide with Star Wars opening everything up, and then Martin establishing beyond equivocation to the masses that fantasy wasn't necessarily for children. He really blew that narrative out of the water. We knew that, but he established that for the greater reading community. I feel that we're going to swing back to niche again. And that's going to make a very fertile period. Excuse me?
Sorry, Janny. I think this whole, this huge surge of independent publishing is really making we can go so unique, and you can have your character in P.L. Stewart's just this, I don't know, I hated him at first, but man, did he go through an arc that just I loved, and and you end up just, I don't know, it's just brilliant. I just love this. You have John's where it's it's pure fun, and I just love what independent publishing is doing right now.
Yeah. Fantasy, if we restrict it to just the genre, that maybe you could say 19th century in origin, but if you broaden it to the fantastic, it's had a pretty good run, really, hasn't it? I mean, you go all the way back to Gilgamesh if you want. You can go back to the Iliad and the Odyssey. I won't say Beowulf again, but you can go to I don't want to get that F-bomb again. You can go all over the place, really. I think we should figure out by now that with all of the storytelling that we have for all these thousands of years, that we probably need the fantastic. So I'm not terribly worried about where fantasy is going. I think we're always going to need the fantastic in storytelling, and that it's here to stay. Whatever the current trends might be, the fantastic will remain.
And I think that it's there are so many books out there of every type and genre. There is room within fantasy for every subgenre. There's room for indie. There's room for traditionally published. There's room for the gamut. And but I do think that there will always be a hallmark traditionally published fantasy series that have a fandom that keeps the genre certainly at that upper tier, that upper echelon of consciousness, such as the Martins, the Eriksons, the Wurts, etc. And then you have groundbreaking indies carrying the torch as well, like the Ryan Cahills, the Phillip Chases, so many great authors that are, really making a name for themselves, as was noted in these niche areas. So I think fantasy is alive and well. It's not going anywhere anytime soon, and I love the diversity and there's some really fantastic, innovative things going on, and I don't think it's going anywhere. I think it's just going to continue to flourish. I think there's, sometimes we can get caught up in what's going on in a particular aspect, such as specifically traditional publishers seems to be focusing on romantasy, shortening their books. They don't want big, chunky epics, etc. But that trend, as I think somebody mentioned, that will change and pass, and it will revert back to, potentially how it was before, and we'll see all kinds of different trends. But I think the genre is alive and well.
I couldn't agree with what PL said more. Those were exactly my thoughts, PL. I think that there's room in the genre for all these different kinds of subgenres. And I agree that things move in trends. And yes, I mean, publishing, I imagine they're doing what they think sells, right? But I think that there's still hope for niche genres or niche ideas in fantasy, and also just interest in epic stories. I think, as of, if you look at the popularity of the Dune movies, I think that speaks to the audience right now. And there are some really big ideas in Dune, and as portrayed in the films as well. Three-body problem, that's obviously having a day as well. So I think that the audience is still there. I think it's just a matter of what's trending at the time. But I totally agree with everything PL said. And I don't think any genre has to be against another genre or anything like that. I think there's room to enjoy all of it. And I think that there's also a misunderstanding too, because part of this that isn't helped by YouTube in some ways. I think that there's this idea that people who read romantasy only read romantasy. People who read Malazan and Words of Light and Shadow only read epic fantasy. And I tend to be somebody who prefers epic fantasy, and I have not read any romantasy on my channel that I know of, that I could think of. But I know of a lot of people who read all of it. So I think it's important to understand that, there's room in fantasy for all types of fantasy.
Well,
I really
regards
enjoy the fact that we're watching some books come around that sort of had fallen off. I mean, everybody is reading Dune right now. Everybody's massively into Shogun right now. Everybody is digging up books. Lonesome Dove is passing the rounds, and I thought, gee, these are books I read.
We're talking about
way
just
back.
what Mike has
Yeah.
read, by the way. Like,
Yeah, but then you get a book which is absolutely going to tear the cloth of everything. When Steven wrote Rejoice, a Knife to the Heart. I mean, talk about ripping ideas into bitty little shreds and flinging them into your face and saying, look at this, because our society tends to repress aggression and think it's bad. And removing that and what would happen and how the whole house of cards would come down. It's just, I love a concept book like that. And I love to read all kinds of things. I have read a few romantasies just to see what was going on. So yeah, it's a big tent. There's room for all of it.
I want to hear Blaise's answer, because I notice he keeps trying to respond.
Thanks, John. No worries at all. With regards to trends in like the fantasy genre, like romantasy, they'll all come and go. The good news is that everyone has something that they love to read. There's plenty of options for that. With me, with regards to my TBR and like wanting to read something, I want to read a big epic that when I close the book, I want to feel something like tremendous, either extreme happiness, sadness, sometimes crushing defeat. And every single author here, like their books, Philip, I only read your first book, has made me feel that. And the first book I ever read the first series I've ever read that did that to me was John Gwen's Faithful and the Fallen. And if you guys have read Ruin, you know what I'm talking about. Yeah. I just wanted, and once I got that, I was just hooked. I needed to have that feeling. And also that series and the series that you guys are creating, I wanted to keep rereading it and having to revisit it the older and older I get. So, and you bring in different life experiences to it. That's the sign of a classic in my view, and I'm always looking for those. Hence my quest for under the radar books. So,
Steven, any do you have a answer for that?
No, not particularly. Go ahead.
I lost my train of thought. Sorry. I'll go ahead and get to another question from one of the other ones that I've got over here. JCM Burm asked Janny, "What's next? Start another Unda College?"
No.
Can someone read that big word for me?
No, I wouldn't survive it. I mean, it was a war to get this thing continuously produced. It will be one-offs. It might be some thriller type stuff. It might be. I will dip into this universe again because there's a whole lot of untold story in the back history and the future history. But am I going to do another massive work like this? No, because things are changing too fast, and it really. I'm really proud to be here, but it took too much out of me to keep it on the level and keep it getting published and keep it with all the changes that were hitting it. So there just isn't enough time in my life to finish something as massive as this again. Not to say never, but
yeah.
It's not on the plan. It's not on the docket.
I think it was a little more joking, but obviously you kind of wanted to know what might be next. So I would assume like some more one shots at least.
Definitely.
Okay. My good friend Richard of Iron Age Media asks for the panel, do you write short fiction? Do you have any favorite authors you follow specifically for their short fiction?
Read Janny's short fiction related to the Wars of Light and Shadow. It's phenomenal. It's all phenomenal.
And
so
that's Camelot.
Yeah, there's a short fiction collection out, and Steven, you've done some short works because I've got them little thin volumes.
Well, the novellas, sure. I did recently a short story. First time in about 20 odd years. So generally, I'm sticking with the novels at the moment, but occasionally, I guess there's an idea that's suited to a short story. I tend. Right now, I'm reading mostly nonfiction anyway, so I'm sort of right out of the loop when it comes to what's happening in fiction. But it's weird. The last short story I did, it took almost as much research as a novel would. And so, in terms of time investment and preparation, I'm not seeing much difference between the two. So it makes more sense for me to continue with novels.
I think everyone should read Steven Erikson's Crackpot Trail because there's a character there that is basically a biographical rendition of AP. Everyone
very accurately, yes.
Yeah, accurate portrayal of AP Canavan in Crackpot Trail. Everybody read it. You will know AP through and through.
Any similarity between the literary critic in a Crackpot Trail called Apto Canavalian. Any similarity between that character and me is clearly coincidental.
I'm going up to the loft to get my copy immediately after this ends.
I've got my copy right behind me.
I was like, I've got my copy of Goats of Glory right here.
Oh, wow. That goes back a way.
I do want to give a shout out to Alice Munro because we just lost her. And she is a brilliant short story writer, not fantasy, but fellow Canadian, I think, Steven. She just passed away recently.
I basically, I guess, cut my teeth reading her stuff. Yeah, phenomenal. Cyclical stuff. So they were short stories, but they were all related to each other. Relating to the community that she was in. Yeah, great writer.
Okay. I have found that short fiction, from my perspective, is a very different beast. And the writer brain always makes me want to write more and more, and I have to parse it back. So it's a very different writing muscle than novel writing. It was something I kind of did a little bit when I was a hobby writer. I was writing on fictionpress.org, which was kind of a progenitor of, it's very similar to Royal Road, but that actually, believe it or not, from my perspective, it kind of impaired my ability to write books, because I was writing that chapter by chapter by chapter by chapter. And the goal of each chapter was just to get to the end of the chapter, not plotting out an actual, narrative that, knowing where I wanted to exactly stop. But in going back to short fiction here, it's very interesting because I have to parse down so much of the world building, the character, and you just kind of have to get straight to, the meat and bones of the story and make it worth reading in a short, in a short period of time. And anyone that's curious, this is right out of my reach. I actually, Richard from Iron Age Media publishes Anvil Magazine, which the third issue here I'm actually published, and he published one of my short stories. And thank you very much, Richard. I appreciate that. I was able to pay my editor with that money too.
Congratulations, John. That's great.
Yeah, it was very cool. Thank you. And Anvil Magazine's a great place, guys. If you want short fiction, comic books, things like that, they publish a lot of independent authors. And if you want to find someone who's a new favorite, and issue 4 is coming up, and it's got Blaise Pardoe, who is a long tenured author who was in the BattleTech space. And if you ever want to feel shamed about your novel output, guys, this time last year, Blaise Pardoe had put out a first novel in a new series called Land and Sea. And now a year later, he's working on the 7th.
Wow.
So eat that. I feel it took me forever just to put one book out.
I'd like to pass the microphone over to Don because he survived the writing of this. We got married just before the first book was published. So here from the other side.
All right, what do you want to know? The dirty secrets?
Yeah.
Yes. Spill the tea.
I don't know. Let's see. I had to sit on the sidelines while her publisher did things that were just not right. And what? Well, I can say this, you can't. It was very frustrating to see her working very hard and then find that, someone would write a blurb on the cover that had nothing to do with the book. And so she would have to fight to put a different blurb on the book just so that it would reach a proper audience. And that kind of thing went on and on and on. And it was mistypecast for its lifetime until recently. I mean, you guys have done more than her publisher has in finding the truth of these books.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is one of the best things about this kind of online community is.
I'm scribbling.
Oh yeah, well there's that. Janny reminded me of I would wake up in the middle of the night and see a flashlight going on while she's scribbling on a pad. And then, the next morning, here comes, another chapter in the book, and, she gets these ideas like, it reminded me of Norman Rockwell having a sketchbook next to his bed. She'd be there with a flashlight, and I actually bought her a pen with a light on it so that she could, do both at the same time.
Was there pacing like back and forth through the rough scenes? Or
no, just rustling of sheets.
I have to do the same. I have to write my little ideas in the middle of the night on a little app on my phone, or I will forget them, and I don't want to forget them.
Janny's old school.
Unfortunately, I don't have much more to hand, but I do have a Don Mates original right here.
Oh, there it is. Yes.
See, that's why I don't have you guys next to each other, because I want people to be able to tell you apart.
Yeah. Otherwise, it'd be impossible.
Yeah. But, Phillip, get real close to the screen and see how well I caught your. There, see? They look pretty. Yeah, not a bad job.
It is amazing. It kind of reminds me a little bit of the Phil Collins song, Land of Confusion. I don't know if you all remember that.
Oh, yeah.
I was there. Yeah, I was there for it.
I don't know if I should thank you, John, or not. But
there's a story behind this. This is because Phillip always came to ICFA, and 2 years running, he had to have another commitment, and he couldn't make it, and he wasn't going to be there for his book launch. So We first put his head on a stick so he could have his book launch at ICFA and be present, and then it turned into The Mask.
Now my head is back.
You better show up next year, because then we'll do something worse.
I have to. I think I have to. Yeah.
It's like, Philip, you do not want to give Dawn ideas about how to escalate this.
No.
Because we've heard some of the stories of things that Dawn has got up to in the past. You don't want to be giving him license.
No.
If anyone wants to do that with my head, please just make me look like an orc. Okay, I got to stay on brand.
Nice.
Don't encourage him. Don't encourage him. Trust me.
Real quick question for Miss Janny. Wants to know if you would ever want to see a graphic novel adaptation of your work.
As long as they don't come to me with AI, and as long as they've read it, and as long as they love it, then I'll sit down and talk. But don't come near me with AI art. I just booted one of those idiots out the door. Not a chance I'm going near that.
Gracious.
But Johnny, don't all of your characters have like 7 fingers on one hand and 3 arms? And AI art seems perfect for that, you know, with your lack of attention to detail and everything that you do.
Steven, would you see a graphic novel adaptation with AI art and give all of your, I mean, your characters definitely have swords coming out of their arms.
Yeah, well, actually, I'm just thinking now about an entire alternate story, and something involving characters with multiple, like too many limbs and too many fingers and all the rest. And just actually taking the storyline as if the AI universe actually then manifested into a real universe.
Oh no, now you're scaring me for real.
We were here for the start, guys. We were here for the start.
I'm not going to lie. There's been some pictures produced by AI art that are just pure nightmare fuel.
Yep.
It almost makes me wonder if AI is tapping into some kind of demonic entity. I know that sounds silly to think about, but I mean, I don't know where some of them pictures could have come from.
But
besides
John,
the
it
demonic
learned
entity.
off the internet. There's your demonic entity. It
Exactly.
learned off the internet.
That's a good point.
Did you see that article today about somebody asking how to clean their washing machine, and it told them to mix up chlorine with vinegar, and that makes chlorine gas. You're going to kill people doing this.
My son, who's 17, showed me a article that he found where AI told somebody that, yes, it is okay to leave dogs in hot cars. So
Yeah,
I'm not going to be asking for advice from AI anytime soon.
No, I don't want to encourage them. But yeah, that's scary, Steven. That's going to make, if you write that.
For the sake of YouTube, I must clarify.
For the sake of humanity, do it now.
Do not leave your dogs in a hot car. It is not safe. Disclaimer. Another question for the authors on the panel from a fellow indie author, Mr. J.R. Carroll, wants to know what makes a book epic: size, high fantasy, or the story itself? Steven, can we start with you?
Yes.
I don't know. All of the above, I guess. I don't know. Like I said, it's not. I'm kind of sort of floundering on the notion of epic fantasy. I don't know.
I can quote you. Remember, we sat on that panel at ICFA, and they asked what was epic fantasy, and you very correctly answered it was that moment when society collides with itself and breaks, and the epic bridges the change.
Wow, did I say that?
You said that.
Okay.
Having you quoted, because Tori and I did a discussion on epic fantasy, and I know, Janny, you had this incredible definition in the chat.
Well, it was inspired by that, and I had something else to say. And the funny thing is, I responded to one of your essays on our fantasy, and I've forgotten what it was because you said, "Oh, you nutshelled that. You killed the whole panel," and I forgot what that was. So it isn't. It was it Grimdark?
It was Grimdark.
So what was it?
I have no idea. I just remember the panel was Grimdark.
Oh no, it was epic fantasy. Anyway, there Steven did a wonderful essay on the subject on our fantasy. It's probably archived. And there were people responding to that. But yeah, so you put it in a nutshell pretty well.
Yeah, like I said, I'm very, very jet lagged. So I think maybe 1/3 of my brain is at work at the moment. So,
Well, we're lucky to have you here. We'll take you jet lagged. I think we drove Don out.
Well,
I
I'm not
know
going to
that in
disagree
the.
with. Sorry, Johanna, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that the Stevenson articles that you are often talking about on epic fantasy, he talks about how epic fantasy is not, or he didn't equate epic with word length or with page length necessarily. I just wanted to add that.
Donaldson, yeah.
I'm sorry, Donaldson. I did it again. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would say that, and sorry to interrupt, but that like the Long Price Quartet, it's actually kind of shorter books, but it's epic fantasy.
Yeah, I think epic fantasy is when, for me, and maybe this is just, I'm just trying to qualify what the best epic fantasy for me is, just subjectively, just that turns the world upside down. The world is turned upside down, and it doesn't matter whether it's because of a Dark Lord or because, there's political upheaval within a small area, but it's just, for me, it's the world's turned upside down, and there's some kind of macro problem potentially involved in it, and it could start as micro, but I just feel like it's about the disruption, the unrest. Like, that's what I love about epic fantasy.
Yeah, I think that's just the scope's a really big part of it too, which is kind of just adds to that. But it's just what kind of story, and it can be a very long story, can be part of it, or it can just be a story that's about really big ideas, really big things as well. And I've read plenty of very long epics and definitely short things. Like Long Price Quartet was a really great call out of a very, very epic story done in a very short amount of time as well too. So can definitely have both.
My answer on that panel was a little bit different because I was using the Iliad and the Odyssey as my template, mostly the Odyssey, where I saw epic fantasy also as that moment where morality in a society or in a character breaks down or is broken down by circumstances that are greater than themselves. And they may go forward and break every rule, every moral rule in the book. And in the process of doing that, come full cycle and redefine it. Redefine what that ideal meant to begin with. So I saw that as a facet of epic fantasy as well.
See, that reminds me of PL's book, where I had somebody tell me, like, I love this, but it's so hard to recommend it to people because the main character is a terrible person.
I guess there could be many definitions. I kind of go back to what AP was saying earlier in the panel about the micro and the macro. I always equate that in my mind with epic fantasy. And I know that Donaldson talked in his essay about an epic being about, especially the original epics, confronting some of the most important questions in mankind. So I think that speaks to the themes being very broad and far-reaching for humanity, where we're going, what it means for us, and that could be explored again in grand scale macro way, but also in a micro way. So I think it can go both ways, but I think it has to have both in order for it to be epic in my mind.
Just to piggyback off that, I think a lot of readers think of like epic fantasy nowadays is like massive in scope and massive in like the story, like across several continents, but when the earliest epic fantasies I've read was very, very condensed and very micro. Assassin's Apprentice, and over the course of the Farseer trilogy, you see how big the world is. But at the heart of it is just Fitz Chivalry Farseer, a bastard trying to make his way in the world, and no one thinks he can do anything. He's an outcast, and following his story and the emotional connections you have towards him. And everyone surrounding him. That's in the building of that over the entire series. That's what made it epic for me. And of course, it gets much bigger, but it's the personal relationships and how they grow that defines like an epic fantasy for me.
I will say, when it comes to fantasy, the thing I like most about fantasy is how versatile it is. You can tell so many different kinds of stories in it, and if you go back in time and look at where fantasy kind of originated from, essentially everything that broke off from it is fantasy. I'm one of them people that does not really differentiate between fantasy, science fiction, horror, romance, what have you. In Westerns, because in their own way, they're all a type of fantasy. And that's one reason why when you get those genre mashup books, that they work so well together, because they're all fantasy in some kind of way. So, you know, when you have, say, the romantasy, which is big right now, that meshes well because the romance is epic, the world building is epic. It's all fantasy in some form, and you can throw a genre bending element in there. But again, it's still fantasy by what measure you use to make the fantasy come alive in the text. It doesn't matter.
Well, you could almost say at this point in time, looking at what humanity has done to itself with the internet, what is reality? I mean, we're writing fantasy, but what is reality? You look at what people are putting forth and believing right now, the diversity of what they insist is true. What is reality?
I think a lot of people try and convince themselves of narratives that they don't want to believe in. And you know what? My brain didn't know where that was going, so I'm going to duck out and toss it to someone else. Guys, I've worked a lot of work in my life, and I've been under a lot of stress in my times. I drink a lot of coffee, so my brain occasionally does have hiccups like that. I started going somewhere, and then I found that the road itself was done. And I've always maintained I'm a better writer than a speaker because I can actually think about what I want to write. I don't always think about what I say. Sorry. So that is officially derailed. Let me bring up a question to kind of cover for that. I apologize. Mr. T. Baggins says to the authors, what do you prioritize in world building? Ms. Janny, what do you prioritize in world building?
I think for me, a lot of things, but one of the major things is the world itself, because without that, there is no life. And so putting that as a priority, I mean, I go back to that essay, that series, it was a 2-part essay that Steven wrote that he put up on our fantasy on the complaint of violence in a lot of these Marvel films in the big comic franchises, where you'll just have this entertainment that wrecks a whole city and buildings come crashing down, but none of the focus on the individual or the small things that get in the way of that. So that whole thing of let's just wreck an entire landscape for a story, or let's just wreck an entire landscape for a mineral that we're pulling out of the earth, or let's just wreck that whole concept of, can we detach from our own environment to the point where it becomes nothing, where we can just tear up whatever we want in order to achieve some other short-term goal. So world building to me not only encompasses all the civilizations that make their impact on a world, and not only the individual beliefs about that world, but what does that world signify itself? Because that is our life support. That is our gift of diversity as far as looking at what the natural world can do. No individual one of us can even touch that.
Do you start with the world building, or do you start with the story? Do you start with both of them together?
In the case of War of Light and Shadows, I started with one seed idea, a trope I wanted to turn on its head. The idea that the big blonde guy was the hero and that the little short dark-haired guy was going to be the villain. That was the seed idea. I wanted to turn that on its head. Where it grew very, very, very quickly was that one thing turning on its head exploded in all directions. And actually, before I started even writing the first chapter, I sat down and wrote thousands and thousands of years and eras of history to set this one little seed idea into the middle of it. So I spent probably several years just developing the world before I even started writing chapter 1. And that world building and that creating that setting to give it the dimension that those two characters were going to impact went on for decades.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah,
What about you, Phil?
one of the reasons I fell in love with fantasy is, I think a lot of the times, and I think Steven, you were talking about this earlier when you were talking about archaeology and informing your world building, as it were. But the idea that we can see ourselves reflected in the past, that when we see the remnants of prior civilizations or peoples who have come before us, that somehow we recognize ourselves there, and their stories speak to us in ways that are not just haunting, but also beautiful. I think that we can have our search for answers reflected in those people who've gone before us, and that is something that I try to build into my world, a sense of history, a sense of the past, a sense of what's been lost in the many lives that have come before in the same landscape that is the present of the story. And I feel that's just something that I love personally about fantasy. I think fantasy tends to often engage with that. You don't have to do that to write fantasy, but it's something that I love when I see it in fantasy. And I certainly see it in the Wars of Light and Shadow and in the Malazan books as well, in spades. Maybe one of the reasons why I'm a huge fan of both series.
The Mystery of the Lost Civilization.
Yeah.
We've all played with that. Paul's played with that.
PL, yeah.
Malazan,
I mean,
yeah.
he's looking at, I mean, his inspiration in many ways is the Atlantis myth. And it's just brilliantly done. There you have a lost civilization. Now what, you know?
Have you checked down the back of the sofa? Because it's amazing the number of lost things you find there.
Our house is going to be cat toys, but never mind.
And you know, the thing about the lost civilizations, to me, the big question for that particular aspect of storytelling is not just what happened to them, but will it happen to us?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And if so, how can we possibly prevent it? That was essentially the plot of Mass Effect, which is still one of my favorite sci-fi universes of all time. Didn't quite end the way I think a lot of people wanted to. They didn't stick the landing, but that first game and the plot that it presented was really, really good at that. And that very evocative.
And why does it feel like we're barreling toward that?
Well, that's that concept I talked about, you know, history repeating itself and circular things happening in the world. And I mean, I know for me, I certainly, I like unreliable narration, and I like things starting off small and growing exponentially from there. I like these almost like myopic, purblind views because that's what life is all about. Where right now I could turn on the TV and see what's happening in Afghanistan or Portugal or South America, but I'm not there. And I really don't know what's happening there. I'm not currently there, but I might go there one day. I might visit there. I might get some understanding of it. But when I write, I start with the character and the character's view outward. And the character has all this information. He has, you know, he or she may have studied history, may have studied lore, but they weren't there in the past. They may have heard about these things about this wonderful kingdom next door, but they haven't visited there yet. So you hear about all these things, but yet you're not present, and your viewpoint is always going to be skewed until you've had that experience. And I love those skewed perspectives where you can't necessarily trust what the person's saying. They think they know, but perhaps they don't, or maybe they do, and you're not sure. And I love that ambiguity. And I love because that's very much how we are as human beings. And we have these perspectives, and we think we know things, and we think because we've learned or read it in a book or seen it on TV or read it on the internet that's how it is. But we all start off small, micro, in our hometown, in our home province or state, in our home country. And then we travel and we see a bit of something else, and then we see a bit of something else. And that's very much also how I write.
Thank you, Niko, for dropping in. He had to go, guys, and we will be wrapping up the stream in about 15 to 10 minutes or so. We've been live for 140. Yeah, about 15 minutes. just to give everyone a bit of a heads up, because I've got a hard 2-hour time limit. So I can go pick up my son from drafting school. Hopefully he did good on his test today. We'll be praying for him. But does anyone of my fellow illustrious booktubers have any questions for Janny or Steven while they're here?
I don't really, I mean, I was just going to say congrats. I just can't even imagine what you're feeling. I'm sure Steven Erikson is the only one that can really feel close to completing such an epic series over this many years. And I can't even imagine how great this must feel to see this get out there and to see, as we've been talking about for years, just the kind of things that are there from the very beginning, the things that were set in place from the beginning. And so I'm just so excited for you. And this is so great. And again, that everybody is really finally figuring this out.
Well, it's a great comeuppance because I finished it and I didn't die. You know how many readers wrote to me and said, "You're going to be dead before this gets done"? Oh yeah, that's worse than 1-star review. It's like, thank you. I don't think so.
What did you mistake? Goodness.
I think George R. Martin knows how that feels too.
Probably.
Okay, that's another one on the bingo card. I knew it was going to come up.
There we go.
I mean, authors aren't real people, are they? No.
Yeah. I wanted to quickly respond to something that you said earlier, Janny, and it kind of tailors off or piggybacks off what Phillip was saying about Erikson's civilizations and archaeology. I just think that's neat that what you were saying about how world building starts with the world. Like, I take that to mean you mean the actual planet and the elements. And I think it's something that we've talked about in our discussions about Wars of Light and Shadow, is just how well everything is interconnected. The magic is interconnected with the world itself, the metaphysics, and then that affects the characters, and everything just seems so cohesive. There's a through line with all of these different elements, and there's so many. I just think that's beautiful too. And I think it's important too, is speaking also to Steven Erikson, like your theme of compassion as one of the most prominent theme in Blaise, and compassion being a prominent theme in your work, Janny, because I think that it just made me think about last night. I was listening to this poem, a spoken poem online, and the person was talking about how in this day and age, this current generation mistakes independence for apathy, where they walk by somebody on the street and they're being independent, but they're trying not to feel connected to people, and they're trying not to feel connected to the earth. And in the poem, she was inviting people to feel like people belong to one another, and to feel like we belong to the earth, and feel a connection with that, and how that can shift us. And so it just kind of, when you were talking about that, Janny, and Phillip, when you were talking about that with ancient civilizations and history, it just all kind of came together in my head, how we think of these things as separate things, world building and environment and compassion, but I can't help but feel like there's got to be some kind of through line there. And
there is, because I've heard it said that love and hate are not opposites. They're closer together on the scale of emotion. They're closer together. The true opposite of both is apathy.
Mm-hmm.
And the horrifying thing of our times is, I know a lot of people who are working in environmental sciences, and they're completely mind blown, depressed. Some of them are even committing suicide because they're watching a train wreck and they're screaming at the top of their lungs. And is it apathy, or is it self-protection that makes people cover their eyes because they feel they're powerless? We're not, but people are taught to believe they're powerless, that the small thing that you can do. And it's like, how do you survive the pressures of what is going on in the bigger picture? And our way of doing it was, every time we saw something that diminished the environment, we made a small personal choice to do something differently. It's like the power company forced our city into a 30-year contract when the city wanted a 15-year contract. And my way was, I'm not running my dryer anymore. I'm going to hang my clothes out. And I've been doing that for 20 years. because the dryer's the biggest energy hog in the house. It's a tiny little thing, but it was the way that I kept my sanity. When I saw the pollinators dying, I put a beehive out there. I could care less what those bees do. I just keep them happy. We planted flowers. We did. So every time there was a decision made on the macro, we did a micro decision. Even it was spend $1 more in a different way every week. Because that was my way of keeping my sanity, saying I'm not going to be run over by this thing. And if one drop of water in the pond can make a difference, I'm going to put that drop of water in the pond.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I'm just gonna mention going back to the question of what you prioritize and how that relates to Janny, your answer, and what you were saying, Johanna. The interconnectedness is what you prioritize, right? That you're building a world, but nothing exists in vacuum. Everything is related to everything else. And once that has to be sort of recognized, acknowledged, then there is an implicit responsibility for everything within there because it's related to everything else, right? You can't mess up one thing without having a knock-on effect all the way down and all the way across. And so I think when you create a world and you do world building that invokes that kind of interconnectedness, the responsibilities are implicit, and implicit in responsibilities is compassion. So it all just sort of steps into place at that point.
Beautiful.
And I think that level of interconnectedness, where you can see the points of connection between things and how they are mutually supportive, that makes settings, because we're talking about world building, creating setting, but that makes the setting feel more authentic. Not necessarily real. I hate going to real for this, but authentic and verisimilitudinous, and with an aspect of mimesis to it, that it makes it feel more solid. Whereas, earlier on, Johnny had mentioned in superhero movies, like the buildings being smashed down, that large scale spectacle. But that's not epic. That's just large scale. Epic has to have that core of truth to it, that core of authenticity, because without that, it is empty spectacle. And we can see this in world building, where people have incredibly clever ideas, but these ideas are paper thin. It's a gloss over the setting, and you go, literally, it's like when you envisage it's almost like, yeah, it's the set in a theater. Like it's telling me there are mountains in the background, but I know it's just a set. I know that's cardboard with paint on it. When we see truly great world building and we get a sense of that authenticity, it's because of that depth to it. That depth is created through thinking through the ramifications and connecting it. If you change the day-night cycle, how does that affect how people live? Because you don't just go, oh, well, it's just the same. Because the day-night cycle is so integral to how we set up our societies. It's things like that. And when authors like Janny Wurts and Steven Erikson pay attention to those things, that's when we read it, even if it's the tiniest detail, it seems to be a throwaway line. It's those things that communicate this reality to us, that make us believe in this reality, that help us with our suspension of disbelief and create that authenticity. So that would just be how I would comment on this.
You have a theater set until consciousness gives it meaning. And the interaction between consciousness expands that meaning. Otherwise, it's just a spectacle and it's empty. So if you ignore the individual reaction and the individual interaction, you have nothing. If that isn't acknowledged, if that isn't played upon, if we're not looking through that lens, because that's what gives it meaning.
And it's our readers' sense, as it's the sense of a suspension of disbelief and playing with our audience's imaginations that really helps a lot of those elements come to life. You mentioned a play, and what I was thinking of, and it might be a kind of a silly example, but if you go back and you watch a lot of like the old Batman show from the 70s, a lot of their sets, especially for like when they're going into like the villain's lairs, a lot of them was just a sound stage with a black cloth put a product, but what was there? Batman was there, the villain was there, the evil machine that they were trying to stop was there, and a few props scattered about. You didn't notice the black background because your imagination was focused on the elements that were put there in front of you. And that's something I learned from Sarah Douglas, was that your readers have very active imaginations, and figuring out how to get their imagination to work for you is one of the best tools that you can have as an author, because then they're doing most of the work. You're just bringing out that evocative imagery in their imaginations, and you're making them do your work for you almost. But I want to say we're going to have to go ahead and call the stream about here. I could go on with you guys for a long time, and believe me, AP was bringing up superhero stories. I'm like, oh no, I can't start in on the super, because that would be a great conversation to have, but that's a whole other conversation on a whole another stream. But I want to go and thank everybody here: Blaise, Bryce, Johanna, AP, Mr. PL Stuart, Mr. Phillip Chase, Mr. Steven Erikson, and Miss Janny Wurts, especially, for all being here this evening, contribute to this conversation. And congratulations to Miss Janny for finally bringing out, the finale of your work, an accomplishment that any author should be proud of.
Thank you all for being here and making today special, because otherwise it would have been just Don and I doing our usual work around the house, and we couldn't have that. So thank you, John, for stepping up and hosting this. Thank you all for being here. It's been a fabulous evening, and we did indeed get some of those ICFA vibes that we get in the pool bar after dark. So my heart goes out to all of you, everyone. You're important to me, and I appreciate you being here.
Congratulations, Janny.
Congratulations, Janny. We're so proud of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, John, for having us.
Thanks for making our lives better.
Until next time, guys, thank you for all being here this evening, and